I was in my garage organizing tools when I heard my side gate slam shut. And when I looked out the window, I saw Susan Pemberton marching down my driveway with my red gas can clutched in her hands like she had just discovered evidence of a crime. My name is Quincy Norris, and I have lived in the Riverside Meadows community in Boise, Idaho for 3 years now. The neighborhood is nice enough with its cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns, but the homeowner association here is something else entirely. Susan Pemberton is the HOA president, a 52-year-old woman with severely highlighted blonde hair that she wears in what I can only describe as an aggressive bob. She has made it her personal mission to enforce every single rule in our community handbook, plus about a dozen she seems to have invented herself. I walked out of my garage just as she reached the sidewalk. The February air was cold enough to see my breath, and there was still about 8 inches of snow on the ground from the storm we had gotten 2 days ago. I had been using my snowblower all morning to clear not just my driveway, but also my elderly neighbor Harold's driveway next door. That gas can Susan was holding belonged to me, and I had left it sitting next to my snowblower near the side of my house. "Susan," I called out, my voice already tired because any interaction with her was exhausting. "That is my gas can. What are you doing with it?" She spun around, her face already arranged in that expression of righteous anger that HOA board members must practice in the mirror. "This gas can was visible from the street, Quincy. Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our community guidelines clearly states that no fuel containers, lawn equipment, or maintenance supplies may be stored in a manner visible from any public right-of-way." I took a deep breath and reminded myself that losing my temper would only make this worse. "Susan, I was literally using it. I was in the middle of clearing snow. I set it down for 5 minutes to go inside and grab some water." "That is not my concern," she said, holding the gas can even tighter. "The rules exist for everyone, and they do not include exceptions for temporary use. This violation will be documented, and you will receive a fine of $75. You may retrieve your gas can from my office after the board meeting next Tuesday, provided you have paid the fine and can show proof of payment." My patience was already wearing thin. "You cannot just take my property, Susan. That is theft." Her eyes narrowed. "This is not theft. This is enforcement of community standards. If you have a problem with the rules, you should have read them before purchasing property in this community." I gestured toward my driveway and Harold's driveway next door. I was doing a good deed. Harold is 78 years old. He should not be out there shoveling heavy snow. I was helping him. "How noble," Susan said in a voice dripping with sarcasm. "However, your charitable activities do not exempt you from HOA regulations. Perhaps next time you can help your neighbor without creating an eyesore for the entire community." A gas can sitting next to a snowblower was not an eyesore. This was insane. But Susan was already turning away, walking back toward her own house 3 streets over with my property in her hands. I stood there in the cold, watching her go, and felt that familiar mix of anger and disbelief that came with every HOA interaction in this neighborhood. I pulled out my phone and took several photos of Susan walking away with my gas can. Then I went inside to figure out what my options were. My wife Gina had warned me when we moved here that the HOA seemed overzealous, but I had brushed off her concerns. Now, I was regretting not paying more attention during our initial walkthrough of the neighborhood. Inside, I called my buddy Marcus, who lived 2 streets over. He had dealt with Susan before when she cited him for having his trash cans visible from the street on a non-trash day, even though the garbage truck had simply not come at the scheduled time. "She did what?" Marcus asked when I explained the situation. Just walked into my property and took my gas can. Said I am getting a $75 fine and cannot have it back until I pay and attend some board meeting. Marcus let out a low whistle. Man, she is getting worse. Last month, she tried to fine the Hendersons because their son's basketball hoop was 6 inches over the property line into their own driveway. Said it created a visual distraction for drivers. This has to be illegal, I said. She cannot just take people's things. You would think so, but she has been doing stuff like this for 2 years now, and nobody has really fought back. Most people just pay the fines because it is easier than dealing with her. Well, I am not paying it, I said firmly. That is my property and I was actively using it. She had no right to take it. Good luck, man. Let me know if you need me to back you up at the board meeting or whatever. After hanging up with Marcus, I did some research on Idaho property law and HOA regulations. What I found was not encouraging. HOAs in Idaho have broad authority to enforce their rules, and our community handbook did technically give the board the right to remove violations from properties after documenting them. However, I was pretty sure that removing items while they were actively in use was pushing the boundaries of that authority. I decided to go over to Susan's house and try to reason with her one more time. Maybe if I caught her in a calmer moment, she would see how ridiculous this was. Susan lived in one of the larger homes in the development, a 2-story colonial with black shutters and a front lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine. I rang the doorbell and waited, trying to prepare myself for another unpleasant conversation. She opened the door already frowning. Quincy, I thought I made myself clear. Susan, please, can we just talk about this reasonably? That gas can cost me $45 and I need it to finish clearing the snow. You can document your violation or whatever you need to do, but please just let me have my property back. No, she said simply. You need to learn that rules apply to everyone. Too many people in this community think they can bend the rules whenever it is convenient for them, and it creates chaos. I will not allow Riverside Meadows to decline in standards and property values because residents cannot follow simple guidelines. This is not about property values, I said, my frustration rising. This is about you taking something that belongs to me while I was in the middle of using it. That is not enforcement, that is just being unreasonable. Her face flushed red. I am not unreasonable. I am dedicated to this community. Unlike some people, I actually care about maintaining the standards that make this neighborhood desirable. Now, I have work to do. You will get your gas can back on Tuesday if you follow the proper procedure. Good day. She shut the door in my face. I stood on her porch for a moment, taking deep breaths and reminding myself that yelling or pounding on her door would only make things worse. Then I walked back home, already planning my next move. When I got back, Harold was standing in his driveway, leaning on his shovel and looking at my half-finished snowblowing job. Everything okay, Quincy? He called over. I saw Susan over here earlier. I walked over to his side of the property line. She took my gas can, said it was a violation because it was visible from the street. Harold shook his head slowly. That woman is something else. Last year she tried to tell me my rose bushes were too tall. Said they exceeded the maximum height for front yard plantings. I have been growing those roses for 12 years. What did you do? I trimmed them, Harold admitted. I did not have the energy to fight her. My wife was sick at the time and I just wanted peace and quiet. I felt bad bringing up his wife. She had passed away about 6 months ago, which was part of why I made sure to help Harold with things like snow removal now. He was on his own and tasks that used to be manageable for him were getting harder. Well, I am not trimming anything, I said. And I am getting my gas can back. Harold smiled slightly. Good for you. Somebody needs to stand up to her. I spent the rest of that afternoon researching my options. I found the community handbook online and read through the entire thing, paying special attention to the sections about violations and enforcement. The language was vague enough that Susan could probably argue she was within her rights, but there was also nothing that explicitly allowed the HOA to confiscate property that was actively in use. I also looked up Susan's history with the HOA. She had been president for 3 years, and before that, she had been on the board for 2 years. Reading through old meeting minutes posted on the community website, I could see a pattern of increasingly strict enforcement and new rules being added almost quarterly. Some of them were reasonable, like requiring people to keep their lawns mowed and not parking commercial vehicles on the street. Others were absurd, like the rule about holiday decorations needing to be approved by the board before installation, or the one about not being allowed to have visible garden hoses. That evening, my wife came home from her job at the hospital. Gina works as a nurse in the emergency department, and she had been pulling double shifts lately because they were short-staffed. I told her about the gas can incident, and she looked as frustrated as I felt. "I told you this HOA was going to be a problem," she said, dropping her bag on the kitchen counter. "When we did the walkthrough, that woman stopped us 3 times to tell us about different rules. She measured our car to make sure it would fit in the garage because visible parking is limited to 4 hours. I know, I said. I should have listened. So what are you going to do? I am not paying the fine, and I am getting my gas can back before Tuesday. I needed to finish the driveways, and I am not going to let her hold my property hostage over some made-up violation." Gina looked worried. "Just be careful. I do not want this to turn into a huge thing. We still have to live here." "It is already a huge thing," I pointed out. "She stole my property." The next morning, I woke up early and decided to try a different approach. I called the non-emergency line for the Boise Police Department and explained the situation. The officer I spoke with listened patiently, then told me that while he understood my frustration, this sounded like a civil matter between me and the HOA. "But she took my property without permission," I said. "Is that not theft?" "It might be, but it also might fall under the authority granted to her by your HOA agreement. You would probably need to take this to small claims court or consult with a lawyer who specializes in HOA disputes." That was not the answer I wanted, but I thanked him for his time and hung up. I was not ready to involve lawyers yet, but I was also not going to let Susan keep my gas can for a week over a ridiculous technicality. I decided to go back to her house and try one more time to reason with her. If that did not work, I would take other measures. This time when I rang Susan's doorbell, her husband answered. I had met Roger Pemberton a few times at neighborhood events. He was a quiet guy who worked in accounting and always seemed slightly uncomfortable when Susan was around. "Hi, Quincy," he said. "Looking for Susan?" "Yeah, if she is available. She is at a board meeting at Brenda's house. Should be back in an hour or so." "Thanks, Roger." I walked back home, thinking about my options. An hour later, I saw Susan's silver Lexus pull into her driveway. I gave her a few minutes to get settled, then walked back over. This time, when I rang the bell, she answered with an expression that suggested I was the last person she wanted to see. "Quincy, I have nothing more to say to you until Tuesday. Susan, please. I am asking you, person to person, to give me back my gas can. I need it. I have more snow to clear and I cannot afford to buy a new one right now. You should have thought about that before leaving it visible from the street. I was using it. I was in the middle of a task." "Do you not see how unreasonable this is?" Her jaw tightened. "What I see is a homeowner who thinks the rules do not apply to him. Do you know how many violations I deal with every week? If I make an exception for you, then I have to make exceptions for everyone. And before you know it, this neighborhood looks like a trailer park. The classism in that statement made my blood boil, but I kept my voice level. Nobody is asking you to turn the neighborhood into anything. I am asking you to use common sense. The gas can was next to equipment I was actively operating. It was not being stored there. I was in the middle of helping my elderly neighbor. Your neighbor should hire a snow removal service if he cannot maintain his property himself. He is on a fixed income, Susan. Not everyone can afford to hire people for everything. That is not my problem, and it is not an excuse to violate community standards. I realized I was getting nowhere. Susan was not interested in reason or compromise. She had decided this was about power and control, and she was not going to back down. Fine, I said. Keep the gas can, but this is not over. I walked home feeling defeated but also more determined than ever. I was not going to let Susan push me around, and I was definitely not going to pay a $75 fine for something I did not do wrong. That evening, I made a plan. I knew where Susan kept HOA materials because she had mentioned once during a neighborhood meeting that she had a dedicated office in her basement. If I could get my gas can back on my own, this whole situation would be resolved. I want to be clear that I am not normally the kind of person who takes matters into his own hands like this, but I felt like I was out of options. Susan had stolen my property. The police would not help, and I could not afford to wait a week and pay a fine for the privilege of getting it back. The next night, I waited until late when I knew Susan and Roger would be asleep. Their house went dark around 10:30, and I gave it another hour to be safe. Then I quietly walked over to their property. I am not proud of this, but I checked their side gate and found it unlocked. I slipped into their backyard, my heart pounding. There was a basement window that looked into what appeared to be an office, and I could see boxes labeled with HOA documents. I was trying to figure out if the window was locked when suddenly a light flicked on in the basement. I froze, pressing myself against the side of the house. Through the window, I could see Susan walking into the office in a bathrobe. She was carrying what looked like paperwork. I held my breath, not daring to move. Then I realized what I was doing. I was lurking in my HOA president's backyard in the middle of the night, essentially attempting to break into her house. This was insane. No matter how justified I felt, this was not the right way to handle things. I carefully backed away from the window and made my way out of the backyard, my heart still racing. When I got home, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about how Susan's unreasonable behavior had pushed me to consider doing something I would normally never do. The next morning, I decided to try a more official route. I sent an email to the entire HOA board, not just Susan. I explained what had happened, included the photos I had taken of Susan leaving my property with my gas can, and formally requested an emergency board meeting to address what I considered to be theft of personal property. Within an hour, I got a response from Susan saying that my email was inappropriate and that all concerns should be directed to her as board president. She copied the other board members on her response, essentially shutting down any chance of them helping me. But then I got a separate email from another board member, a woman named Patricia Chen who lived on the north side of the development. She said she wanted to talk to me privately and asked if I could meet her at the coffee shop outside the neighborhood that afternoon. I agreed immediately. Patricia turned out to be a reasonable person, which was refreshing. She was in her mid-40s and worked as a real estate attorney, which made her perspective on HOA issues valuable. "I will be honest with you, Quincy," she said over coffee. Susan has been getting more and more aggressive with enforcement, and several of us on the board are concerned. But she has a lot of support from a certain group of homeowners who like her strict approach. She took my gas can while I was actively using it, I said. How is that okay? It is not, Patricia agreed. But the problem is that our HOA rules give the board broad authority to remove violations, and Susan interprets that very liberally. I have tried to rein her in, but I am only 1 vote out of 5. So what can I do? Technically, you could sue the HOA in small claims court, but that is expensive and time-consuming, and there is no guarantee you would win. Another option is to gather support from other homeowners and push for new board elections. Susan's term is up in 6 months. I need my gas can back now, not in 6 months. Patricia sighed. I know. Look, I will bring this up at Tuesday's meeting. I cannot promise anything, but I will argue that confiscating equipment while it is in active use goes beyond reasonable enforcement. Thank you, I said, feeling a small glimmer of hope. Just be careful, Patricia warned. Susan takes challenges to her authority very personally. She has made life difficult for people who have opposed her in the past. Over the next few days, I talked to other neighbors about their experiences with Susan and the HOA. What I discovered was disturbing. Nearly everyone had a story about unreasonable fines, arbitrary rule enforcement, or intimidation tactics. Marcus told me about a family 3 streets over who had been fined repeatedly for their children's toys being visible in the front yard. The fines eventually totaled over $1,000, and the family had to take out a loan to pay them off to avoid a lien being placed on their home. Harold told me about another neighbor who had been cited for parking their car on the street overnight when they had guests visiting. The guest's car had been parked legally on a public street, but Susan had argued that it violated the community's aesthetic standards. I started to realize that this was not just about my gas can. This was about a pattern of abuse of power that had been going on for years, and nobody had successfully challenged it because fighting an HOA is expensive and exhausting. On Tuesday evening, I went to the board meeting. It was held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that was used for events and meetings. About 20 homeowners were there, which was apparently a high turnout. Susan sat at the front table with the other 4 board members. She looked surprised to see so many people, but she quickly composed herself and called the meeting to order. Before we begin with regular business, Patricia said, I would like to add an item to the agenda regarding a recent property confiscation incident. Susan's expression hardened. That matter is being handled through normal violation procedures. It does not require board discussion. I disagree, Patricia said firmly. When the board confiscates homeowner property, that is something we should all be aware of and approve. Another board member, a man named Jim who I had never spoken to before, nodded. I would like to hear about this as well. Susan looked like she wanted to argue, but she was outvoted. Fine. Quincy Norris received a violation notice for improper storage of fuel containers. The container was removed as per our authority to remove violations, and he can retrieve it once he has paid the associated fine. The gas can was next to my snowblower while I was actively using it, I said, standing up. I had set it down for 5 minutes to get water. Susan took it from my property without asking while I was in the middle of clearing snow from my driveway and my elderly neighbor's driveway. Several homeowners murmured in surprise. The rules do not include exceptions for temporary use, Susan said coldly. A violation is a violation. That is absurd, someone called out from the back. You cannot take people's stuff while they are using it. The rules are the rules, Susan repeated. Patricia leaned forward. Susan, I think we need to revisit our interpretation of the violation removal policy. It was intended to allow us to remove abandoned items or clear violations like dead trees or unpermitted structures. It was not meant to authorize taking tools and equipment while homeowners are actively using them. I disagree with your interpretation, Susan said. But if the board wants to vote on limiting my ability to enforce violations, we can do that. Just understand that it will result in declining property values and community standards. I move that we return Mr. Norris's gas can immediately and waive the fine, Patricia said. I second, Jim added. Susan looked furious, but she called for a vote. The motion passed 3-2 with Susan and one other board member voting against it. Fine, Susan said through gritted teeth. Mr. Norris, you can pick up your gas can after this meeting. I felt a surge of relief, but I also noticed the way Susan was looking at me. Patricia had been right. Susan took challenges personally, and I had just humiliated her in front of the entire board and a room full of homeowners. After the meeting, Susan retrieved my gas can from her car with obvious reluctance. She practically threw it at me. I hope you are happy, she said. You have undermined the entire enforcement structure of this HOA. I just wanted my property back, I said. This neighborhood is going to fall apart because of people like you who think the rules do not matter. She stormed off before I could respond. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. Over the next week, I started noticing Susan driving slowly past my house multiple times a day. She was watching me, waiting for me to make any mistake she could use to cite me for a violation. On Thursday, I received a violation notice in the mail. Apparently, my lawn had excessive growth and needed to be mowed immediately. It was February. There was still snow on the ground. My lawn was dormant and had not grown at all. This was clearly retaliation. I took photos of my lawn and emailed them to Patricia, explaining that I had received a baseless violation notice. She responded quickly, saying this was getting out of hand and that she was going to call a special board meeting to address Susan's behavior. That Saturday, I was in my garage working on organizing my tools when I heard someone walk up my driveway. I looked up and saw Susan standing there, holding her phone and taking pictures of my garage. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Documenting violations," she said. "Your garage door has been open for over an hour, which violates Section 18, Paragraph 2, regarding open garage doors creating visual clutter. I am working in my garage. Of course the door is open. The rule does not include exceptions for active use," she said, throwing my own words from the board meeting back at me. I was about to respond when I noticed something. In her other hand, Susan was holding my gas can again. She must have grabbed it from where I had set it next to my snowblower. "Susan, put that down. That is my property." "This is evidence of a repeat violation," she said. "You clearly have not learned your lesson about proper storage of fuel containers. It is next to my snowblower. I am about to use it. You cannot keep taking my things." "The board's ruling was misguided," Susan said. "I am within my rights as HOA president to enforce violations, and I intend to do so." Something in me snapped. I had tried to be reasonable. I had followed the proper procedures. I had even won at the board meeting, but Susan was not going to stop. She was going to keep harassing me, keep retaliating, keep making my life miserable because I had dared to challenge her authority. I pulled out my phone and started recording video. "Susan, I am asking you one more time to put down my gas can and leave my property." "Or what?" she said, her face flushed with anger. "You are going to call the police. They already told you this is a civil matter. Actually, what you are doing right now is theft. The board already ruled that you had to return my property." You are now taking it again without any new violation notice, without any documentation, and against a direct board ruling. That is not HOA enforcement. That is just stealing." For the first time, Susan looked uncertain. She glanced down at the gas can in her hand as if only just realizing what she was doing. "I am documenting a violation," she said, but her voice was less confident. "You are stealing my property on camera," I said, still recording. "Put it down and leave, or I am calling the police right now and pressing charges." Susan's face went through several different expressions: anger, uncertainty, defiance. But she must have realized she had crossed a line because she set the gas can down on my driveway. "This is not over," she said. "You have made an enemy, Quincy. I will make sure you regret ever moving to this neighborhood." She turned and walked away, and I captured all of it on video. I immediately sent the video to Patricia and the other board members who had voted with her. I also made a backup copy and saved it in multiple places. This was evidence of harassment and attempted theft, and I was not going to let Susan get away with it. Patricia called me within 10 minutes of receiving the video. "This is insane," she said. "Susan is completely out of control. I am calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow evening, and I am bringing a motion to remove her as president. Can you do that?" "Yes, though it requires a majority board vote. But after this video, I think I can get the votes. This is beyond unprofessional. This is potentially criminal." The next evening's emergency board meeting had even more homeowners in attendance than the previous one. Word had spread about what was happening, and people were angry. Susan looked composed when she walked in, but I could see tension in her shoulders. She knew she was in trouble. Patricia started the meeting by playing my video on a laptop connected to a projector. Everyone watched as Susan took my gas can, argued with me, and then threatened me before leaving. "This is unacceptable," Patricia said when the video finished. "Susan, you were explicitly told by this board to return Mr. Norris's property and to stop harassing him about this gas can issue. Instead, you returned to his property, took his belongings again, and threatened him. This is not HOA enforcement. This is personal retaliation and abuse of power." "I was documenting a violation," Susan said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You were stealing," Jim said bluntly. "And you threatened a homeowner. I move that we remove Susan Pemberton from her position as HOA president, effective immediately." "I second," Patricia said. The vote was 4-1, with only Susan voting against it. She was out. Susan's face went pale, then red. "You are all making a huge mistake. This neighborhood needs strong leadership, and you are throwing that away because of one whining homeowner who does not want to follow the rules." "No," Patricia said firmly. "What this neighborhood needs is fair leadership that enforces rules reasonably and does not abuse its power. You have been warned multiple times about your aggressive enforcement tactics, and you have not changed. This board meeting is adjourned." Susan gathered her things in silence, her hands shaking with what I assumed was rage. She left without saying another word, and I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. But I should have known Susan was not going to go quietly. 2 days later, I was at work when I got a call from Gina. She sounded upset. "Someone slashed the tires on my car," she said. "All 4 of them. It was parked in our driveway, and now it is sitting on its rims." I felt a chill run through me. "Did you see who did it?" "No, but I can guess. Quincy, this is getting scary. What if Susan is escalating?" "I am coming home right now. Call the police and file a report." I left work and drove home as fast as I legally could. When I got there, a police officer was already taking Gina's statement. My wife's car was indeed sitting on 4 flat tires, clearly slashed. The officer took my statement as well and asked if I had any reason to believe someone might target us. I explained the whole situation with Susan and the HOA, including the videos I had of her taking my gas can and threatening me. "You have any proof she did this?" the officer asked. "No," I admitted. "But she threatened me 2 days ago and now my wife's car is vandalized. That is a pretty clear connection." "I understand, but without evidence, I cannot arrest anyone." "I will include your suspicion in my report, and if you have security cameras that might have caught something, that would be helpful." I did not have security cameras, which I was now regretting. The officer said he would increase patrols in the neighborhood and told us to call immediately if anything else happened. After he left, Gina and I sat in the living room, both of us shaken. "I want to move," Gina said quietly. "I do not feel safe here anymore." "We just bought this house 2 years ago," I said. "We cannot afford to move right now." "Then what do we do? Wait for her to escalate even more?" I did not have a good answer. The next day, I went to Home Depot and bought a security camera system. I spent the afternoon installing cameras covering our driveway, front yard, backyard, and garage. If Susan or anyone else tried something again, I would have evidence. I also talked to our neighbors, asking if any of them had cameras that might have caught the tire slashing. Most did not, but Marcus said his camera might have picked up something since he was 2 houses down and his camera faced the street. He checked the footage and found something interesting. Around 2 in the morning on the night my wife's tires were slashed, a silver Lexus had driven slowly down our street, stopped near our house for about 5 minutes, and then drove away. Marcus's camera was not quite close enough to read the license plate, but we both knew Susan drove a silver Lexus. I took that footage to the police station and asked to speak with the officer who had taken my report. He looked at the footage, made a copy, and said he would follow up on it. "I cannot promise anything," he said. "The car in that video could belong to anyone, but I will add it to the case file." 3 days passed without incident. I was starting to hope that maybe Susan had backed off, that she had realized she was risking serious legal consequences. Then I got a call from Harold. "Quincy, you need to come over here," he said, his voice shaky. "Someone painted something on my garage door, and I think it is because of you helping me." I rushed next door and found Harold standing in his driveway, staring at his garage door. Someone had spray-painted "violators" in large red letters across the white door. I felt sick. This was my fault. Susan was targeting Harold because he was associated with me. "I am so sorry," I said. "I will pay to have this cleaned up or repainted." "It is not about the money," Harold said. He looked scared. "Quincy, I am an old man. I do not need this kind of trouble. Maybe you should just apologize to Susan and make this go away." "Harold, I did not do anything wrong. She is the one breaking the law. She vandalized your property. Can you prove it?" I could not, which was the problem. Susan was being careful not to get caught, but the message was clear. She was going to keep escalating until I backed down or moved away. I spent the rest of that day helping Harold clean the spray paint off his garage door. It took several hours and a lot of elbow grease, but we eventually got it looking mostly normal. The whole time, I was seething with anger. That evening, I went back to Susan's house. I knew this was probably a bad idea, but I needed to confront her directly. Roger answered the door again. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me. "Is Susan home?" I asked. "She is, but I do not think she wants to talk to you." "I do not care what she wants. Someone vandalized my neighbor's property and someone slashed my wife's tires. I think she knows something about it." Roger's face fell. "Look, man, Susan has been really upset since she got removed from the board. She has barely eaten or slept. I do not think she is thinking clearly." Where was she 2 nights ago around 2 in the morning? I do not know. I was asleep. Why? Because someone slashed my wife's tires around that time, and a car matching Susan's was seen on our street. Roger looked genuinely shocked. You think Susan did that? I think she is capable of it, yes. I will talk to her, Roger said quietly, but please just go. If she sees you here, it is going to make things worse. I left, feeling frustrated. Roger seemed like a decent guy, but he was clearly unable or unwilling to control his wife's behavior. When I got home, I found a notice taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, but it was not signed by Susan. Patricia had been appointed interim president, and the notice was informing me that the board was conducting an investigation into recent harassment and vandalism in the neighborhood. That was something, at least. 2 more days passed. I was constantly checking my security cameras, jumping at every sound, worried about what Susan might do next. The stress was affecting my work and my marriage. Gina and I were barely speaking because she was angry that I had not just paid the original fine and avoided all of this. Then, on Saturday morning, everything came to a head. I was in my garage, and I had my gas can sitting on my workbench because I was refilling it to use my lawn mower for the first time this season as the snow had finally melted. The garage door was open because I was airing out the space after a long winter. Susan appeared in my driveway, walking fast with a determined expression. She headed straight for my garage. "Susan, stop right there," I said, stepping between her and the workbench. "You are not allowed on my property. That gas can is a violation and I am going to document it," she said. "You are not the HOA president anymore. You have no authority to do anything. I am still a homeowner and I have the right to report violations. You have the right to report them, not to trespass on my property and take my belongings. Leave. Now." Susan's eyes were wild. She was not thinking rationally anymore. This had become an obsession for her. She tried to push past me to get to the gas can. I stepped to the side, blocking her again. "Susan, I am warning you. Leave my property now or I am calling the police." "Give me that gas can," she demanded, her voice rising. "You do not deserve to live in this neighborhood. You have ruined everything." "I have not ruined anything. You did this to yourself by abusing your power." She lunged for the workbench, trying to grab the gas can. I grabbed her arm to stop her and she spun around, raising her other hand as if to hit me. "Do not touch me," I said loudly, stepping back and releasing her arm. "I am recording all of this." My security cameras were running, capturing everything. Susan seemed to realize what she was doing. She looked at the camera mounted in the corner of my garage, then back at me. Her face went pale. Then her eyes focused on something on the side of my gas can, and she froze completely. I followed her gaze and realized what she was looking at. On the side of the gas can was a sticker I had forgotten about. It was from the Boise Volunteer Fire Department, where I had been volunteering for the past 5 years. The sticker showed the department logo and my volunteer firefighter ID number. Susan's face went from pale to white. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "You are a firefighter," she finally whispered. "Volunteer firefighter, yes. What does that have to do with anything?" But Susan was already backing away, stumbling over her own feet. The fight had completely left her. She looked terrified. "I did not know," she said. "I did not know you were with the fire department." Again, what does that have to do with anything? But Susan was not listening. She turned and practically ran down my driveway, got in her car, and drove away at a speed that was definitely above the neighborhood limit. I stood in my garage, completely confused. Why would a fire department sticker cause such a dramatic reaction? Then I remembered something. About 6 years ago, before I moved to this neighborhood. There had been a major news story in Boise about an HOA president who had harassed a volunteer firefighter over parking violations. The firefighter had been responding to emergency calls at odd hours and sometimes parked his personal vehicle on the street when he got home late. The HOA president had his car towed multiple times and filed dozens of violation notices. The story had blown up on social media and in the local news. The community had rallied behind the firefighter, and the HOA president had been not only removed from the board but also faced a lawsuit from the firefighter for harassment. The lawsuit had resulted in a significant judgment against the HOA president personally. Susan must have remembered that story. She must have realized that harassing a volunteer firefighter, especially one with documented evidence of her behavior, was going to bring down a lot more trouble than she could handle. I immediately called Patricia and told her what had just happened. She said she would call an emergency board meeting for that evening. At the meeting, I showed the security footage of Susan trespassing on my property and trying to take my gas can again, despite no longer being president and despite multiple warnings. I also explained her reaction when she saw the fire department sticker. "This is now a legal matter," Patricia said grimly. "Susan has repeatedly trespassed, stolen property, and we have circumstantial evidence linking her to vandalism. I am recommending that the HOA hire an attorney and fully cooperate with any police investigation into her behavior." The board voted unanimously to accept Patricia's recommendation. I also went back to the police station and filed an additional report about Susan's trespassing and attempted theft, providing them with the security footage. The officer who took my report said they now had enough to potentially charge Susan with criminal trespass and harassment. 3 days later, Susan was arrested. The police had obtained a warrant for her phone records and location data, which showed she had been in our neighborhood at the times when my wife's tires were slashed and Harold's garage was vandalized. They also found searches on her phone for things like how to slash tires without getting caught and prosecuting HOA members for harassment. She was charged with criminal mischief, vandalism, harassment, and multiple counts of trespassing. The evidence was overwhelming. Roger called me the day after her arrest. He sounded devastated. "I am so sorry," he said. "I knew Susan was upset, but I had no idea she was doing these things. I should have paid more attention. I should have stopped her." "It is not your fault," I said, and I meant it. Susan made her own choices. "She is talking about pleading guilty," Roger said. "Her lawyer says with the evidence against her, she does not have much choice. She will probably get probation and community service, and she has to pay restitution for all the damage she caused." "That seems fair," I said. Susan did plead guilty. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution totaling $4,500 to cover the damage to my wife's tires, Harold's garage, court costs, and the HOA's legal fees for dealing with her misconduct. She was also permanently banned from serving on the HOA board or any other HOA in Idaho. The judge had harsh words for her during sentencing. He talked about how HOAs are supposed to serve communities, not terrorize them, and how people in positions of authority have a responsibility to use that power appropriately. Roger and Susan moved out of the neighborhood 2 months later. Roger told me privately that their marriage was probably not going to survive this, and he needed a fresh start away from all the reminders of what Susan had done. Patricia remained as HOA president, and she immediately began reforming the community rules. The board passed new guidelines limiting their enforcement authority. requiring documented warnings before fines could be issued, and creating an appeals process for homeowners who felt they had been unfairly cited. They also passed a rule that HOA board members could not confiscate homeowner property under any circumstances. Harold and I continued our tradition of me helping him with his snow removal and yard work. He told me several times how grateful he was that I had stood up to Susan, because he felt like the whole neighborhood had been living in fear of her. Marcus organized a neighborhood barbecue that summer, and it was the best community event I had ever been to. Without Susan's oppressive presence, people were relaxed and friendly. Several neighbors thanked me for taking a stand, and a few shared their own stories of how Susan's behavior had affected them. Gina and I decided to stay in the house. With the HOA reforms and Susan gone, Riverside Meadows actually became a pleasant place to live. We installed a new security system that we kept, just to be safe, but we never had another serious problem with the HOA. I continued my work with the Boise Volunteer Fire Department, and I made sure to put fire department stickers on all of my equipment. Not because I wanted special treatment, but because I was proud of the work we did and the community we served. The whole experience taught me some important lessons. First, when people in positions of authority abuse their power, it is important to stand up to them, even when it is difficult and scary. Second, documentation is everything. If I had not taken photos and videos, Susan might have gotten away with her behavior. Third, community matters. The support I received from neighbors like Marcus, Harold, and Patricia made it possible to fight back against Susan's harassment. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the nature of HOAs themselves. These organizations can serve a valuable purpose when run by reasonable people who understand that rules are meant to serve the community, not control it. But when they are run by people like Susan who see enforcement as a way to exert power over others, they can make people's lives miserable. I hope that, by sharing this story, other people who are dealing with unreasonable HOA board members will feel empowered to stand up for themselves. Document everything. Know your rights, and do not be afraid to push back when someone is clearly abusing their authority. As for my gas can, it still sits next to my snowblower in my garage. I use it regularly for my lawn equipment and snow removal, and I have never had another person try to take it. Every time I see that fire department sticker on the side, I remember the look on Susan's face when she realized she had been harassing a volunteer firefighter, and I cannot help but smile a little. The fire department sticker had not given me any special rights or protections, but it had reminded Susan of the consequences that can come from targeting people who serve their community. She had already been in a legally precarious position with all her harassment and property damage. But the realization that I was a firefighter, combined with the knowledge of what had happened to that other HOA president years ago, had finally made her understand how much trouble she was in. In the end, justice was served. Susan faced real consequences for her actions. The HOA was reformed to prevent future abuse, and our neighborhood became a better place to live. And I got to keep my gas can right where it belonged, next to my snowblower in my garage, ready for the next time I needed to clear snow from my driveway and Harold's. Sometimes standing up for what is right is not easy, and sometimes it leads to conflict and stress. But it is always worth it, because communities are built on people who are willing to say enough when someone crosses the line from leadership into tyranny. That is what I did with my HOA Karen, and I would do it again in a heartbeat.